Sure, I'll take one. Well,
And thank you for coming to today's meeting. This meeting, Beyond the Arab Spring, U.S. Engagement in a Changing Middle East, is the sixth and final meetings in a series of presentations and papers coordinated by the United States Institute of Peace and the Wilson Center's Middle East program. The two organizations worked in partnership on the project Reshaping the Strategic Culture of the Middle East, which assess the dynamics of the Arab Spring in reshaping the ways in which new generations of political leaders view the security architecture of the MENA region. The first paper in the series was on global authoritarianism and the Arab Spring, New Challenges for U.S. Diplomacy by Steve Heidemann and Dan Bromberg of USIP. The second one was on Arab perspectives on Iran's role in changing in the Middle East by Shibli Telhami of the University of Maryland and a former fellow at the Wilson Center. The third one was on Arab uprising and mass politics, constraints, change, and uncertainty by Lori Brand of the University of Southern California. The fourth one was on the bread revolutions of 2011 and the political economies of transition by Pete Moore of Case Western Reserve University. The fifth one was on reform, revolution, or status quo, regional dynamics in a changing Arab world by Adid Dawisha of Miami University and a former fellow at the Wilson Center. The authors presented their papers at 5 successful events held at the Wilson Center, and we published them all. You can find them on USIP's website and our website. So today's meeting is the final meeting, which will address how a range of domestic and regional changes in the Middle East have generated new challenges for U.S. diplomacy. And we have once again with us my 2 colleagues from USIP, Steve Heidemann and Dan Bromberg, but the commentator of today's meeting is Danya Greenfield, Acting Director at the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. I think this is the first time you're speaking at the center, so welcome to the Wilson Center, and I hope to host you many, many times in the coming months, year, everything. I must say that it really, since this is our last meeting, it was a joy and pleasure working with both of you and USIP, and we look forward to future, cooperation. And I also would like to thank the USIP staff for, I don't know whether they are here or not, but also my 2 colleagues, Mona Youssef and Kendra Heidemann, who worked diligently to make sure these papers are published and these meetings start on time and finish on time, and you all get invitations from us. So welcome, and we will start with Steve, then move to Dan and Danya. Steve, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hale, and let me, on behalf of USIP, express our thanks to the fabulous work that the Wilson Center has done and that your program and your staff have done in facilitating this series of conversations. Hale mentioned some of the core themes that this series of lectures was intended to cover. It's quite wide-ranging, really a broad-gauged effort to try and assess how the Arab transformations that began in 2011 have affected patterns of local governance, have affected patterns of international engagement with the region, are reshaping some of the core trends that are going to be defining the trajectories of political life in the region over the coming years. And as we arrive at the final set of discussions aiming to try and not exactly summarize or pinpoint, summarize key broad conclusions or pinpoint some of the narrower sort of findings from the project. I think what we all have in mind is that we'd like to try and provide a slightly sort of broader gauged sense of where we seem to be with respect to a number of the key issues that came up in the course of this series of activities. And I'm very pleased to see such a good turnout and look forward to a very kind of robust conversation following the presentations. What I thought might be most useful in getting us started in this wrap-up session of our series was to try to use my time today to summarize where we've come after 3 years of the Arab uprising, but with respect to a very, very specific issue, focusing on how the uprisings have affected governance in the Arab world, and in particular, how the uprisings have affected patterns of authoritarian governance in the Arab world. Where have we come over the past 3 years with respect to modes of authoritarian governance in the Arab world? And let me begin by letting some of the participants who took part in the protests that began in early 2011 convey their sense of where we've come. And what we have here is a statement that was very, very widely circulated in the early period of the uprising that I think communicates very, very vividly the sort of extraordinary enthusiasm that captured the sensibility of those who sensed themselves to be at a moment of significant transformation as these uprisings got underway. Tomorrow we will all be free. And looking at that kind of perception from a somewhat more analytic perspective, the comment suggests that the initial phases of the uprising seemed to vindicate the arguments of academics like Jack Goldstone, a sociologist, or Ian Lustig, a political scientist, that authoritarian regimes in the Arab world were actually more brittle, more ossified, more vulnerable to shocks and more vulnerable to disruptions than those of us who had tended to concentrate on the sources of authoritarian resilience, or the persistence of authoritarian regimes, or their capacity to fend off challenges to their authority might have acknowledged. In fact, these regimes were far less robust, perhaps far less resilient than we might have imagined from the perspective of the early period of the uprisings in 2011. However, a lot of time has passed, and as we enter the 4th year of the uprisings, the picture has changed quite dramatically, and not for the better. I think that early sense of enthusiasm is almost completely gone, including among those who were such enthusiastic participants in the uprisings of 2011. We've seen a fairly steady erosion in processes of democratization in transitional cases. The euphoria of 2011 has given way to much bleaker assessments of the possibilities for political transformation and of the capacity of Arab societies to serve as agents of democratic change. And because of the shift from the position of 2011 to the position of 2013 and subsequently, what we find is that questions about authoritarian resilience and the future of authoritarian governance in the Arab world now once again look far more relevant than we might have anticipated from the vantage point of 2011. And in fact, this is, I think, shown with quite extraordinary and somewhat distressing clarity when we look at the most recent Freedom House scores conveying percentage of, overall levels of freedom in the MENA region in comparison to that of other regions. These data are from late 2013, but the MENA region shows as rating 2% free after 3 years of these 2.5 years of these uprisings. Keep in mind that Israel, which is the only country in the Freedom House ratings that has consistently been rated fully free, is included in this set of cases. If it were not, the percentage would be even lower. So we have, I think, some, a very stark but very vivid demonstration of the limited impact of these uprisings on overall levels of political freedom. Much, much more important is the way people in the Middle East see the broader political trends with respect to freedom and democratization and political openings. And I'm referring, of course, to political cartoonists. And so we have a number of political cartoons. This came out over the summer. It reflects General Sisi planning his election with the same determination that he plans his military career. But the impression that the future of political life is now firmly in the hands of a domineering military figure who's controlling outcomes and so on is very clear. This is an electoral satire around the Algerian presidential campaign for Bouteflika, and as you can say, vote for Bouteflika, alive or dead, doesn't matter. You'll have an opportunity to vote for him. And you know, these kinds of political cartoons, I think, are always an interesting indicator of popular sentiment. And they're reviving themes that are reminiscent of the pre-uprising period, of how authoritarian politics in the region functioned in the pre-authoritarian period. And we read increasingly, I don't know if many of you saw a recent piece in The Atlantic by Shadi Hamid about the relative repressiveness of the Sisi-led regime versus the Morsi regime, but we increasingly see stories that point to the reassertion of old patterns of authoritarian governance in the Arab world, of established patterns of authoritarian governance in the Arab world. But this is where I really think it's important to be careful. I think we have to be very, very cautious about drawing too tight a connection between the modes of authoritarian governance that we see taking shape in the Arab world today and the kinds of authoritarian governance that dominated the Arab world in the pre-uprising period. This isn't to suggest that there aren't elements of continuity, that there certainly are aspects of authoritarian governance that carry over. But I do think that we are seeing some significant shifts in modes of authoritarian governance that we need to be mindful of. And I'd point to two very distinctive models of authoritarian governance that I see emerging in the Arab world as this authoritarian backlash has begun to gather steam and to consolidate itself. The first of these models I'd characterize as authoritarian upgrading 2.0. I'm not a big fan of the 2.0 nomenclature, but never mind, I'll use it for this purpose. And the second, and I think far more troubling model that I see emerging is one that I would characterize as a transition toward much more repressive, much more exclusionary forms of authoritarian governance, which marks really quite a significant shift from what had been far more inclusionary, corporatist models of authoritarian governance that tended to define the way regimes behaved over much of the past half century. And I'll say a little bit more about each of those models, but since few of you could be expected to recall the elements of authoritarian upgrading as well as I do, I wanted to at least provide a little bit of background to what I mean by authoritarian upgrading. And what I'm referring to is essentially a set of tactics that Arab regimes adopted during the 1990s and 2000s to respond to and fend off the kinds of challenges associated with new communications technologies, with pressures for political reform, with pressures for economic and liberalization. And the 5 elements of upgrading that I developed in a paper that came out some time ago include these five policy responses as reactions to the very specific sorts of challenges that these shifts in the political arena posed for Arab regimes during the 1990s and the 2000s. I'm not going to go into these in detail. I did want to simply present them so that you'd have them in the background. And I think if we look at the impact of these strategies, and this is a bit of a nerdy kind of a chart to show, but I think what it suggests is that if you look over the period of the 1990s to almost the present, what you see is not so much democratization. You see a shift in the forms of authoritarian governance that became more prominent in the region. And I would view this on the basis, I will confess, of very thin evidence, as a product of these tactics of authoritarian upgrading that these regimes adopted. I think it produced this kind of change in the composition of authoritarianism, in modes of authoritarian governance in the region during this period. My own sense is that in many ways the uprisings of 2011 can be seen as a response to the limits of these tactics, to some of the destructive effects of these tactics, in particular popular backlash against some of the economic effects of these strategies. On the economic side in particular, which tended to greatly enrich economic networks close to regimes and to create large categories of losers among those who no longer had access to systems of social welfare or to privileged connections to public resources that they had enjoyed in earlier periods. And we have some indicators of this growing popular anger against the consequences of the economic strategies associated with uprising, with authoritarian upgrading. If we look at the sort of protest levels that were beginning to define everyday politics in a number of key Arab countries, even in the period well before the outbreak of the Arab Spring, of the uprisings. This is data for Egypt, and it shows, you look at 06, 07, and 08, these are protests that are very heavily organized around demands, economic demands, and they underscore the extent to which the effects of upgrading were causing losers who were not quiet in making their grievances known. Regimes largely failed to respond to these grievances before 2011. They've certainly taken steps to do so since 2011, but they've done so in ways that are producing these two models of authoritarian governance that I've tried to characterize. On the one hand, I think what we've seen pretty much across the region is attempts by regimes to buy off protesters. We've seen dramatic increases in the use of public spending to mitigate economic grievances that regimes felt drove people into the street. This is a very uneven sample of countries, but it's data from the Deutsche Bank from 2013 that shows how significant the increases in state subsidies were in a large number of governments across the region after 2011. And I think the Jordanian data and the Moroccan data, the Tunisian data are especially telling. A tripling of public spending in Jordan after 2011. These trends have already begun to reverse, but this was the immediate policy response on one level. Beyond this, though, reactions have moved in two broadly different directions. In a small number of cases, Morocco, Jordan, a couple of other countries, regimes have largely sustained the kind of authoritarian upgrading tactics that I summarized in the earlier slide. But alongside of those tactics, they've also expanded the more repressive aspects of upgrading. They've clamped down on the media more fully. They've expanded constraints on civil societies. They have moved even further than in the past to shift their economic ties away from the West, away from governments that might impose conditions on the receipt of aid involving human rights, involving democratization, and so on. In effect, these regimes haven't really abandoned authoritarian upgrading. They've reconfigured how they're deploying it in response to the resurgence of mass politics and the challenges of mass politics. In a second set of cases, including Egypt and Syria and Bahrain, we're seeing variants of authoritarian governance that I think are moving in a much different and much darker direction toward more repressive, more exclusionary forms of authoritarian governance. Syria is obviously the most disturbing case in that category. In each of these cases, governments have taken steps to sharply narrow political contestation. In some cases, in all cases, I think they've moved to reshape and profoundly narrow the social base on which these regimes depend. The Syrian and Bahraini case, we also see that these new modes of governance are increasingly sectarian, that they've been profoundly divisive in deepening patterns of sectarian polarization. And again, these governments have moved even farther than countries in the other category in shifting their economic and diplomatic orientation away from the West, although they've done this in different ways. In Egypt, it's been movement toward the Gulf, Saudi Arabia in the current incarnation, Russia to some extent. In Syria, it's been a different set of external actors who provided critical support, and I think we can say have provided a level of support that has ensured the survival of the regime. Without Iran, without Hezbollah, without Russia, I'm not sure the Assad regime would be here. But in both cases, this reconfiguring or further reconfiguring of diplomatic, political, military, financial relationships has even further insulated these governments from sanctions, from pressures from the West for compromises or concessions on some of the more repressive, some of the more violent strategies they've adopted in response to popular demands for political reform. And so what we have to ask ourselves, I think, is sort of where we've come to after 3+ years of the Arab uprisings. One of the conclusions is that both forms of responses that Arab regimes have developed to the resurgence of mass politics make it even less likely that any kind of Western pressure for democratic change will find any degree of responsiveness among these regimes. And it may well be, in fact, that one of the principal outcomes of the Arab uprisings, an unintended and perhaps even unanticipated outcome, has been the reassertion, the reconfiguring of modes of authoritarian governance that seem, in my view at least, to be perfectly capable of consolidating themselves and of sustaining themselves over an extended period of time, weakening domestic constituencies for reform, building social coalitions that are more deeply committed to more repressive and aggressive strategies of repressing regime challengers at home. And when we combine these elements with a general pattern of retrenchment on the part of the United States from engagement with democratic reform in the region, I think we're left overall with a conclusion that is really fairly grim about the possibilities for building sustainable, viable domestic coalitions that might push back against these shifts in authoritarian governance from within, or about building international coalitions that might support efforts to create such coalitions externally. And I will end my notes there.
Thank you very much. Dan?
Well, thank you very much, Haleh. I'm delighted to be here, and we're delighted to work with you on this series, which has unfolded over quite a bit of time. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since we began, but this was just one in a series of work that we've done together for all these years, and it's always been a delight to work with my colleagues here, and I'm delighted that Danya can join us as well for today's, as Steve put it, grim news. I'm afraid I'm not going to say anything that's going to make you much more optimistic. For quite a few years, Steve and I were part of a group of scholars who were working on the mechanics of autocracy. And when the changes took place and the Arab Spring came about, we were taken to task many times you see what, and I said, well, wait, and let's see what happens. And I have to say, I'm not actually happy that I'm not by any means happy that we have such grim news. It's gotten much worse than I thought it ever would. And I think part of what has gone worse and what has exacerbated the situation is the regional and global context that Steve alluded to in his talk. And this is an enormously complicated subject to spend 10 or 12 minutes on, so I'm just going to offer you a few ideas on this whole theme of global authoritarianism or autocracy and how it plays out in terms of the region and how it helps us to explain and understand why in so many ways the trajectory is not positive. I've focused a lot of my work in the past few years on looking at the dynamics of political negotiation, pact-making, efforts to overcome identity conflicts and their relationship to problems of democratization. But as a consequence of the work that I've done with Steve on this issue of global authoritarianism, I've become much more sensitive to the regional and global dynamics and how that affects these internal dynamics. It's very complicated, but absolutely essential and not very encouraging by any stretch of the imagination. My thoughts on today's panel, and Haleh, I'm going to have a lot to say about Iran today, so because we can't avoid it in so many ways. My thoughts on this panel were inspired when the situation in the Ukraine was getting much worse, and one of Putin's many ideologues providing rationales for his actions, stated in reference to what was going on in Crimea in particular, the whole episode is going to change the rules of the game, he said. Confrontation with the West is welcomed by all too many here to cleanse the elite, to organize the nation. And I said, boy, where have I heard this sort of discourse before? Well, from the leaders of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, among others. It sounded all too familiar, and it reminded me the ways in which the dynamics in the Ukraine and the Crimea and the ways in which the hardliners, particularly in Iran, see those dynamics were giving those hardliners new inspiration and hope that their agenda of antagonism to the West and the mutually shared antagonisms of Russian leaders and Iranian leaders and other leaders would be revived and intensified as a consequence of events in the Crimea, thus intensifying and helping to solidify this dynamic of global authoritarianism or autocracy. Now, I'm just going to read very quickly a couple lines from the report that Steve and I wrote, the monograph that started our series about this dynamic, and this is telling in retrospect. We wrote, as the Arab Spring enters its third year, the contours of a new strategic landscape are taking shape in the Middle East, reflecting the disordered state of regional politics. This landscape is far from stable, yet it contains features that will pose significant challenges for U.S. diplomacy. Among them is the role that leading authoritarian states have assumed, notably Russia and China, but also Iran, as critical actors in regional and international diplomacy, complicating U.S. efforts to respond to the uprisings that began in Tunisia and rapidly spread. Even as these authoritarian actors themselves struggle to absorb the consequences of the Arab Spring, including the uncertain effects of Arab democratization on their regional influence and ambitions, they have worked to consolidate their standing as a counterweight in the Middle East to U.S. and its Western allies. In setting out this new map, we accentuate two related dynamics. First, the ways in which powerful authoritarian regimes collaborate to advance collective interests, and second, their associated bid to use the Arab Spring to mobilize support from regional democratic powers or emerging or democratic powers, including Turkey, Brazil, India, South Africa, and others. And then we went on from there to tell this story, particularly as it related to the intervention in Libya and the ways in which Russia and Iran drew a line in the sand, as it were, terrible metaphor perhaps, when it came to Syria. The kind of interventions that had taken place, the Security Resolution 1973, which had provided the basis for, and the invocation, by the way, implicitly, but for the first time in international diplomacy, of R2P, the responsibility to protect. A very different kind of R2P that Putin seems to be invoking when it comes to the Crimea, I might add. That story was the one we told in the paper, and then we went on from there to look at, particularly the paper focuses on two dynamics. First of all, sort of how this dynamic is manipulated by the members of the authoritarian coalition, but more importantly, how the emerging democracies, and at that time Morsi responded to the desire both to sort of bandwagon with these authoritarian leaders and at the same time resented their support for autocracy, and how this sort of Morsi tried to sort of play this double role. We saw it when he went to Iran, in which he sort of invoked the much of the discourse of the third world discourse of the global autocrats, at the same time effectively chastised his Iranian hosts for supporting Russia in Syria, and this was indicative of this complicated balancing act. We tried to tell that story in the paper, but its long-term meaning, we weren't quite clear, obviously, and many things have happened since then. And I just would like to suggest what has happened in terms of the dynamics of global and regional politics, and what's the good news and what's the bad news. And as I will not surprise you, I'm going to start with the good news and get to the bad news, because it's the lasting news that I think we have to dwell on, I'm afraid to say. So we gave this paper in January 2013, am I correct? And so, in the interim, there are a lot of things that have happened, and I wish to accentuate a few of the factors, as I said, both positive and negative. Well, on the positive side, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly from the point of view of the Russians, the initiation of the P5+1 negotiations on Iran's nuclear program suggested a possible denting in the armor of global autocracy, because it held out the possibility that there might be down the road some meaningful degree of reconciliation between the United States and Iran. Now, of course, the Russians have played an important and constructive role for the most part thus far in supporting the talks. It does not want to see Iran become a nuclear power in an explicit sense, but you have to imagine that from the point of view of Iran's own hardliners, and given the perspective of Rouhani and Zarif in terms of where they want to take Iran regionally and globally, the emergence of these talks, the coming up with an interim agreement and the effort to produce a final agreement provided some degree of challenge to the global autocrats. And I think this is something we need to keep in mind, because this is a central part of the structure in the region. Rouhani and Zarif, I think, would probably, if they had the power to make a difference in this regard, would probably wish to see a somewhat different outcome, perhaps in the long term in Syria, but their capacity to affect that particular agenda is quite limited, at least for now. But in any case, these talks were in that context, I think, a positive development. And I was just noticing the other day, in terms of sort of Russia's own sort of actions in Crimea, to which I shall return, that Zarif had a meeting with the Polish foreign minister some weeks ago, in which he stated that the Ukrainian people had a right to decide their own fate. And he was walking a fine line there, because he's meeting with the Polish foreign minister, after all, and the Poles are justifiably very concerned about what's going on. And I would imagine that Zarif shares, in his own way, some of that concern as well. But what is he going to do? Particularly given that, for the moment, Iran sees its own interest as based in supporting and sustaining Assad, something that Zarif wouldn't necessarily oppose for the moment, at least. But in any case, that press conference suggested some interesting dissonance in terms of the effort of Iran's leaders to manage the competing demands and pressures of global authoritarianism in light of the Crimea situation. Third piece of good news, well, Tunisia. I mean, we have to recognize that we haven't mentioned Tunisia yet, really. This is the one case where the leaders finally were able to overcome very deep-seated ideological identity divides, come up with a constitution. It looked like it was not going to go very far to stave off any kinds of significant regional and global pressures. The internal pressure of terrorism was certainly a significant factor, but that is good news. And Tunisia's leaders, I think, see their future of their country as very much associated with working with the United States and with Western Europe and with democracies. And that is true of Ghannouchi and his party as well, the Nakhta party. So I think that provides the one spot of good news, because it means that the opportunities for global autocrats to sort of manipulate or leverage internal strife or the turn towards a new form of autocracy have perhaps been mitigated just a little bit. And then there's Yemen, about which Danya, I'm sure, can have much more to say. The always strange and weird and challenging case of Yemen, a place where the effort to produce an internal political pact was largely presided over, as you know, by the UN and our friend Jamal Ben Omar, and which Yemen miraculously managed to sort of stay out of some of these regional dynamics. That story is yet to be played out fully, but it represents, I think, still a case where we have not seen a complete slide into the negative dynamics we've talked about. These all provide some sort of context for thinking about dynamics which would not necessarily facilitate the efforts of global autocrats to leverage dynamics of crisis in the region and revved up autocracy. But let's go back to the essential point here, the negative side, because I think it has to be emphasized. And I think the map is pretty clear. First of all, Syria. I mean, it's as far as I can tell, and Steve will correct me because he follows Syria much more closely than I do, the effort, and he mentioned this, of Russia, Iran, Hezbollah to essentially prop up Assad has been fundamental to his survival. And I think he feels reasonably good as where he's sitting right now, and the trajectories are not particularly good for the opposition. Everybody knows the details of that, and that is very much an opening for Russia and Iran, particularly its hardliners, to sustain the kind of dynamics, regional and global dynamics they favor. Egypt, well, those of you who followed General Sisi's upcoming previous visit to Russia, in which apparently Putin almost crowned him president or something to that effect. But I mean, this is a like-minded approach to leadership that the two men share, that's for sure. Although they come from somewhat different backgrounds, they have a mutual shared antagonism to, I think, the United States in many respects. And certainly they see their future as working together, and that was exemplified by the $2 billion deal that Egypt was signing to buy aircraft, helicopters, surface-to-air missiles, and the like, paid for, of course, by the Saudis, who, of course, greatly resent the efforts of Russia and Syria, but nevertheless are propping up Sisi and trying to get payback for with its other regional allies in terms of the role that the Muslim Brethren had played there. So the Egypt story is very much one in which we can see an opportunity for Russia to advance its interests and agenda. I'm not suggesting that Egypt is about to pull out of its relationship with the United States by any stretch of the imagination. Some would argue that this is something the United States should hasten itself. We can talk about that. But certainly the alliance between Egypt and Russia is something to keep an eye on. The third piece of bad news is, well, of course, the Saudi role. Its anger with the U.S. leadership, perhaps understandable in terms, or lack of leadership in terms of Syria. It's concern about the rising influence of the Muslim Brethren, despite, of course, Saudi's own role in promoting that dynamic. This story is full of contradictions, but the Saudi role is, and the Saudi anger, and its anger, of course, with the U.S.-Iran or European-Iran negotiations creates an opening there as well that is for global autocracy, which is not favorable. And last, but certainly not least, the situation in the Ukraine. As somebody who grew up surrounded by the Sovietological world, my two worlds have seemed to come together in this situation in ways that I never quite anticipated. But I think I've written, and I think you put out a piece that I had in Foreign Policy recently. While it is true that in the most recent iteration of the negotiations, P5+1 negotiations, there was an effort by all parties, including, of course, Russia, to sustain the negotiations and not let events in Crimea affect the efforts to produce an agreement. I think that in the long term, if the situation in Ukraine continues the way it seems to be going, and U.S.-Russian relations go even more negative than they are now, the effort to produce agreement could run into serious problems. Not that Russia will pull out or anything like that, but I think Zarif really depends, and Rouhani really depends on the assumption that there will be a high degree of unity among the P5+1 countries, and that unity may begin to dissipate. Russia and Iran have recently agreed, appears, to a $20 billion oil barter arrangement, which has raised concerns that this breaches the interim agreement. And we hear these concerns raised in many arenas, including, of course, the Hill. So this itself is suggestive of the kinds of ways in which the situation in Ukraine really could strengthen the global authoritarian sort of dynamics, and to some extent weaken, I think, the efforts particularly of Zarif and Rouhani in Iran and their allies to leverage the negotiations regionally and internationally to open up space at home. I think that's really what counts here in the long term. That from their perspective, no effort to reopen the Iranian political arena will succeed if the hardliners return in the context of exacerbated U.S.-Iranian relations, and to the extent that the situation in Ukraine is provoking very much that process. It's bad news for the efforts to reopen the political arena in Iran in the long run. So I would say that by way of an update of our paper, that in many respects the regional and global dynamics that supported and created opportunities for global authoritarianism have only proven more effective in that regard, and that we face real challenges, particularly given the reticence of the United States to engage more forcefully in these regions, and the perhaps understandable focus here in terms of our own domestic agendas makes it very difficult to come up with a coherent strategy for meeting these challenges. But we can talk about that in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you, Hala, and to the Wilson Center for inviting me and USIP. And it's great to share a panel with Steve and Dan here. It's a perfect segue, actually, to exactly what I wanted to address, which is a bit about what is the practical application or interpretation of all of these regional and global trends towards authoritarianism, both inside the countries in question in the Arab transitions, as well as on the regional and global scale. And I seem to be in the unfortunate position of being the optimist here, an unenviable position given what's happening. So I'll do my best to try and at least shed some light on what we're trying to do. I would hesitate to say that it's actually an optimistic view about where U.S. policy is. But just to contextualize, I did actually go back to your initial paper and reread it. And there were a couple things that stood out for me about really what's happened in the past year, particularly reflecting on how these authoritarian regimes have collaborated to advance alternatives to Western democracy, and then how they have used the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening to mobilize support from other allies in ways that complicate how the U.S. is able to actually advance its interests. And the first reflection I had in reading the paper is that there is still fundamentally a lack of clarity about what interests the U.S. is trying to advance in the Arab world. After all this time, the reality is that supporting democratic transition has fallen down the totem pole of priorities. And this is perhaps most clear when comparing President Obama's speech in May of 2011, calling on all resources and galvanizing all efforts to support these transitions, and then reflecting on President Obama's speech in this fall at the UN General Assembly, where U.S. policy the interests in the Middle East are clearly outlined as four, and they are countering aggression against allies, non-proliferation, the free flow of energy, and combating or countering terrorism. And two particular areas of focus, advancing Arab-Israeli peace negotiations and the Iran negotiations. Nowhere in those priorities or core interests is mentioned democratic transition or political reform in the region. It was certainly noted in the speech in other areas, but not as a core interest. And so, this really begs the question in looking at this rise in authoritarianism about how important is it to push back actively against this agenda? And is there a coherent or institutionalized effort to push back, both as the United States as well as with our partners? And that's a point that I'll return back to. But this is, I think, lays the foundation for looking at this as really a fundamental shortcoming of U.S.-European coordination and cooperation in how we've responded to the transitions and how we are responding in real time to this rise in authoritarianism, the reemergence of these trends, and the efforts of other authoritarian states, Russia, China, Iran, to actually advance their own agendas. So I think the question that we sort of come back to again is a renewal of the quintessential stability versus democracy debate that seemed to have been put by the wayside in the wake of the Arab Spring, and now seems to be getting a new breath of life, and really pushing the point of how important is a successful transition or successful transitions to democracy and democratic systems in the Arab world, and confronting authoritarianism to U.S. interests. And if it is indeed vital to our interests, how important is it to be cooperating with our allies, with our European partners, and to have a coordinated transatlantic strategy to do this. And just by way of context, this question of transatlantic cooperation is particularly salient. The issue of Ukraine has come up a couple times, and I think, leading into, if we rewind, 4 or 6 months to where we are now, the idea that there was something quintessentially unique about the U.S.-European relationship that held at its core this shared values of pluralistic, responsive, inclusive democratic systems was maybe a bit weaker than it had been in the past. There certainly was ample rhetoric in speeches, paying heed to the unique nature of this relationship. But President Obama had not visited Brussels during his presidency up until last month with the U.S.-EU summit. And there were many opportunities where multilateralism could have played more of a role, and it certainly factors greatly in the way that President Obama paints his strategy, and yet the reality in the application has been perhaps lacking. And I would also note that the relationship itself between ourselves and our European allies had hit an all-time low with disclosure of NSA spying. And this was certainly most acute with Germany, but pervasive across Europe. And unless you're engaging with, European interlocutors, I think from here it's hard to really fully understand how deeply wounding and upsetting this was, how much damage had been done. So returning to the Ukraine crisis, I think that it's actually had a sort of twofold effect on our ability to engage with our European partners. In one hand, it has re-energized and resuscitated the transatlantic partnership, and particularly through NATO, and given it new focus and new purpose. Yet at the same time, it has distracted all transatlantic attention, of course, to dealing with the most acute crisis at hand, leaving very little opportunity to engage on how we should be approaching assistance to these transitioning countries, how we should be developing a strategy to confront this rising tide of authoritarianism. And so that's the sort of unfortunate byproduct of that, is that other issues on the transatlantic agenda, the transatlantic trade partnership agreement and other core issues have also gained less attention given to what's happening. But I think part of what struck me in terms of the response to what's happening in Ukraine is that the real question of how much effort the United States and Europe were willing to put forward to advance and defend the notion of Western-style democracy has been, again, sort of re-energized. The question is, of course, whether or not this will be translated elsewhere. It seems clear that when the political will is there, there is an ability to rally, to focus, to galvanize at least some resources. May not be sufficient, may not be the same approach, the right approach, but certainly there has been pointed and concerted attention. This is exactly what's been lacking in our response to crises in Egypt, in the initial 6 to 12 months in trying to forge a program of assistance towards Tunisia and Yemen and others. So again, I think that the Ukraine example really paints a pointed picture about when there's something that is really thought to be at stake as critical and core to our interests, that we do act in a different way. And so, of course, the corollary is that it really, I think, begs the question of how important is the success of democratic transition in the Arab world. And I think there is a sense, certainly, again, on a rhetorical level, that it is important on the long term, and that that international human rights norms and core democratic principles are, in fact, under threat. When we spoke about this panel, I had just returned from a 10-day trip in Europe, consulting with policymakers both in Brussels and EU institutions, as well as Paris, Rome, and London. And one of the things that we were there to talk about was this point, in fact, but to assess, are there differences about the way Europeans are looking at these transitions? How does that compare with how U.S. policymakers are seeing them? Do we assess them in the same way? And really, where is this on their priority list, certainly given proximity to the southern neighborhood in the Mediterranean and other core interests that Europeans feel much more acutely? And what we came away with was, again, in fact, that there is still this shared sense that the emergence of successful political, pluralistic and inclusive political systems is important. I think the question is the short term versus the long term. And this is where I think the response has been very reactive and very short-term focused, very crisis-driven, both on the U.S. side and on the European side. And I hate to say, picking up on the last point about, is there a strategy here to address these issues? And I think that this is an area where there is considerably more work to be done, and that can be done. One of the reasons why we have not been able to forge a coherent, coordinated strategy is, I think there's a lack of prioritization. Certainly the impact of the global financial crisis and a lack of resources has had an impact. The fact that the transitions themselves are far more difficult than we had anticipated. As Steve outlined, what's happened in these countries has been far bumpier and has presented challenges in ways that I think neither U.S. nor European policymakers had anticipated. And it's also difficult to sort of forge and implement a strategy when we're lacking good interlocutors and institutional capacity on the other side as well. And that has been a pervasive issue that's come up in conversations with people in any of the aid agencies and talking about assistance and what we've been able to actually deliver. I would also know that the rising influence of regional players, Iran, Turkey, and especially the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, have been playing a heightened role. And this has, I think, contributed to a feeling both in the United States and Europe that we have less leverage and less influence, in part because of the role they're playing, in part, again, because of our limited financial resources. And I think perhaps most importantly, the development in these countries over the last 3 years, the increasing political polarization, instability, border security problems, crime, smuggling, the rise of extremist activities, these are the kinds of things that Europeans are obviously thinking of very much coming from North Africa. Has really called into question the idea that supporting democratic change will actually achieve the short-term interests of the United States and Europe. And this is where I get back to, I think, in the long term, there's still very much a sense that this is important. In the short term, the balancing act, I think, has maybe tilted back to sort of the status quo ante, perhaps more than we would have liked to have seen. And this sense of reduced influence, both in the face of what's happening on the ground in these countries, in the face of regional actors, is compounded by the sense that the end goal is less clear, and compounded by less certainty that democratic change is actually in our short-term interests. So the result has been no clear strategy and very little impact on the ground. I think what we walked away with after this visit to Europe was that no one is really asking the question, what is the cost to the United States and Europe if the Arab awakening fails to deliver successful democratic systems and autocracy reemerges and is re-strengthened in chaos, or if continued chaos, in Egypt, and continued chaos in Libya continues to proliferate, whether security challenges in Yemen, continue to manifest themselves. What is actually the cost to our interests? And I think that assessment is what has differentiated the way that we've responded in the Arab world versus, again, the way that we're responding to aggression that Russia is undertaking in Ukraine. So among those that do see that this should be prioritized and see that a stronger U.S.-European cooperation is essential to be more effective, the question is really how do we actually do that? What would a better, more coordinated approach look like? I would say the good news is that the U.S. and Europe, the Americans and Europeans are far more aligned now than we have been in the past. The freedom agenda caused a pretty severe abyss, I think, between how the U.S., the European Union, and key member states were actually seeing the region, how we should engage, what our role was. This difference has now waned. There's far greater convergence, in a sense, between the way that this administration and most European states are looking at what's happening. The key differences are really among European states, between North and South Europe. Those that are closer to the Mediterranean obviously have more of a vested interest, but they're also far more concerned, again, about those short-term security crises, the smuggling and trafficking of weapons, of humans, of contraband. They're much more concerned about that. Northern Europeans tend to be much more interested in a robust defense of human rights and that agenda. So there's a split that's playing out within EU institutions that, as a non-EU, a non-European specialist, is fascinating for a Middle East hand to sort of witness this. The other thing that I would note, I think that has transpired both in the United States and Europe, which I think is quite unfortunate, is that most people are looking at the developments, and I think both of your presentations touched on this, really as threats and not as opportunities. Again, because of the proximity, certainly this is understandable from many of the Southern European countries, but the result is a very reactive approach. The sort of the heady optimism in the start of the Arab awakening has really given way to an acute sense of fear. And the sense that we're reacting to crises, and the sense of danger, the rise of extremism, again, migration, illegal migration, trafficking, is causing this sense of fear, and yet there's a lack of urgency about how to actually respond. So this has essentially left us with a feeling of futility and a sense of decreased leverage and influence. Where I do think we need to shift our thinking, again, is from the short-term response to acute crises in these countries, more to a long-term approach that really does take into consideration the full impact of the increase in these authoritarian trends and what that actually means, not only for our interests, obviously for the people living in these countries themselves. The fact of millions of people living with continued non-representative systems where corruption and nepotism is still rewarded and economic opportunity is quite limited, I think has profound implications not only for those countries, but also for ours as well. If there's one lesson that we've learned, it's that stability cannot come through repression. And we may seems need a reminder that is also the case in the short term, but certainly should be keeping our eye on the long term and situating our policies in a way so that we're at least moving closer to that kind of support. I think I'm going to end here. I have a couple other comments more about transatlantic cooperation. If it comes up in the Q&A, I'm happy to address, but I want to make sure we have enough time to engage in a bit of a conversation. So I will close there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danya. We have 25 minutes for questions, so I'm going to take questions from the floor,
Sure.
unless you feel like commenting.
No, I think that's fine.
Okay. Marina, just please wait for the mic.
Yes. I think my comment goes, or my question goes mostly to what Steve had to say. And I wondered and let me preface this by saying I don't like what I see happening in the Arab world. But I am wondering to what extent in our analysis that we are all tempted to indulge in. everything is falling apart, essentially. We are not indulging a certain tendency to be manic depressive, in the sense that we started out by greatly exaggerating, and this is a collective way that I'm using, the extent to which these countries really had changed. We confused the hope that they would change with an assessment that change was taking place. And now we are discovering that that change never took place. And and we are becoming depressive from being manic. And the example I would take here is that of Egypt, because I would argue that if we go back and look at what happened in Egypt from 2011 on, I would argue that power never left at the hands of the military, ever. It went from Mubarak to the SCAF. It was the SCAF that deposed Mubarak. It stayed in, Morsi becoming president. Well, we all know what happened in that period. He never really had much power. So that essentially now we are saying there has been a regression, where in reality there had never been much progress. And I would argue that there are two countries where real change has taken place. One that I don't understand at all, and that's Yemen. And I don't know to what extent Yemen has.
Share your
Yeah,
I'll clarify everything.
And the second one is Tunisia. But other than that, I don't think there has ever been a power transition that then was there to be reversed.
Steve?
I think you're right. I think our assessments are very heavily influenced by our mood at any given moment and how we respond to what we see happening on the streets of capital cities in the Arab world. I would suggest, though, that I think even if you're absolutely right in your assessment about the limited extent to which political power was redistributed in a meaningful fashion as a result of these protest movements, what we certainly encountered were a series of new and very significant challenges to the existing distribution of power that I think we could not look at and predict with enormous confidence would be within the capacity of these regimes to fend off or to insulate themselves from over time. And if there's an alternative narrative about political trajectories in the region to the one that I set out, it is that having now seen the reassertion of mass politics as a meaning political force in the region, these regimes that are struggling to reassert their authority are likely to face a much higher level and much more sustained level of popular protest and pushback and unrest and turmoil than they anticipate and perhaps that they are capable of dealing with. And so while I agree that perhaps a lot less changed than meets the eye at the top, the nature of the political challenges the regimes confronted did change. I think that they have shaped their responses to the protests of the last 3 years in many ways, specifically to counter and suppress those exact forms of political challenges. And one of the interesting things that I've noted as these processes have unfolded is that even though we worry about and anticipate to some extent sustained turmoil as regimes move to reassert their authority in the region, there's been also, alongside of this kind of process of reconfiguring authoritarian governance, growing popular fatigue and frustration with the instability that has accompanied efforts to wrest meaningful political authority from the hands of these elites in ways that have actually created a social base for the reassertion of authoritarian rule, and not just reassertion, but as I said, transformations in the configuration of authoritarian governance. And so what I'm suggesting perhaps is that we maybe shift our focus not so much so that we're trying to respond to the question of were in fact there significant changes in the distribution of political power in the Arab world as a result of these uprisings, but rather to the question of how have regime responses to these uprisings transformed authoritarian governance in ways that may in fact reanimate or reinvigorate the potential for their long-term survival over time. I mean, and so I think, and that's the kind of question that I think it would be interesting to focus on in the future. Certainly, I don't disagree that there was a lot less to many of these revolutions than met the eye.
Next series?
I'm sorry?
Our next series?
Our next series, perhaps, yes.
Very quickly, first of all, apropos what Steve was saying about the creation of a social base for this authoritarianism, obviously Sisi has a particular way of creating this base, and it's in indulging the most irrational sorts of, it's really a kind of contemporary version of fascism. As far as I can tell, that we've seen, that's unprecedented. I mean, if you and in the region, I mean, this phenomenon we're still trying to understand. It has all the hallmarks of fascist tactics and the indulgence of irrationalism. And that means that the base that he's whipping up, which is really out of fear, and exploiting people's deepest fears, how long can that last? How long will that survive? I think that's a critical question. It's not organized around simply the providing of social benefits, and so it has a deeply irrational aspect to it that's very disconcerting. And then I would say also in terms of Marina's remarks, look, Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, Kuwait are all examples of what I would say is the capacity of what I once called liberalized autocracy to regenerate itself. Particularly in the context of a region where, look at the effect of the crisis in Algeria in 89, 90, 91 on the region, and the conclusion from both oppositions and regimes that, well, democracy we'd love to have, but we don't want the Algerian sort of scenario, so we're going to settle on some second best solution, which is this equilibrium of this sort of semi-authoritarian regime, which goes ups and down in terms of how much closure and how much openness it allows. But I see in that respect a fairly high degree of continuity, and I don't see any sense, either from Algeria and all the recent news or from Morocco, that there is a groundswell of support for sort of moving beyond that particular model.
Tanya, you want to say briefly?
Sure. I would just note that the depression that maybe we're all feeling is matched only by that people in the region and on the ground are feeling as well. And so it's not just in our minds. Yemenis and Egyptians and Libyans are feeling it as well. I'll just say one word about Yemen. For those who don't know, I have a small obsession with the country and track and follow it very closely. And I'm always at a point of distress when asked about it right now, because I'd like to be positive and optimistic, and it gets such a bad rap in general. But I think it is actually fitting more the model of the lack of transfer of power in any real fundamental way. And the success of its transition is that it avoided civil war. It avoided Syria. It avoided even what Libya went through. And so for that, that's notable, and that's certainly worth mentioning. But power has remained in the hands of political party elites and tribal elites, and the end of its 10-month inclusive national dialogue came with a backroom deal that basically hashed things out, and it was in large way a reversion back to the old way of doing things. So time will tell whether or not they're actually able to move beyond that and implement some of the things that have come out of the national dialogue in a way that opens up space and gets new political actors in, but only time will tell.
Thank you. Yes, please. Can you wait for the mic? It's just coming. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is really building on the concept which Steve started about authoritarian upgrading. But I have two questions. Probably either one of the speakers can answer. There is a very unknown or vague understanding of the position of our government here in the US towards the huge activity of Saudi Arabia and the flood of money and influence they put, especially in Egypt after the coup. Was that approving or just being neutral or a lack of any determined position? The other mystery to me also, where is China in all of this? Thank you.
You know, I think Dan may be best positioned to respond to the question on Egypt. I share your sense that there's very, very deep ambivalence among the administration about the Saudi role. I think there's a very clear understanding that the Saudi government is not acting with the explicit intent of supporting Egyptian progress on its roadmap to democracy, and that it is acting in other arenas in which the U.S. is active in ways that that diminish U.S. leverage and often impede U.S. diplomacy. And so I think, you know, this is a moment in which the unfraying of the U.S.-Saudi relationship is coming home to roost in ways with quite significant consequences. But Dan may be able to leave to respond to the Egypt component of that in more detail. With respect to China, I think it's important that we recognize what has been driving Chinese policy toward the Arab Spring more broadly. And I actually think, in my view, and I'm certainly open to conversation about this, it has far less to do with a specific set of economic interests, although there are significant interests, especially with respect to energy. It has much more to do with a very clear, very powerfully held conception of global governance among Chinese elites, in which it is absolutely essential that there exist within the international arena an effective counterweight to what Chinese leaders view as Western dominance of globalization, as Western dominance of international institutions that have not adjusted to significant redistribution of power in the international system with the decline of U.S. hegemony and the rise of a multipolar system, with the willingness of the West to develop policies like responsibility to protect that challenge the more rigid conceptions of sovereignty that China views as absolutely essential to the defense of its interests. And so we see China in a somewhat subordinate role in many of these policy debates, including in the UN, in which it will go along with the Russians in many key decisions, rarely takes the lead, in which it has, I think, carved out for itself the role of a backbencher in some sense, but with a very clear eye on creating mechanisms of global governance that it views as more congenial to its interests, to its trading relationships, and to its determination to defend itself from external interference in its internal affairs. And so I think we need to actually look well beyond the immediacies of these cases to understand Chinese policy behavior in this regard. Of course, I say that with the complete confidence of somebody who knows nothing about China, but you know, we'll leave that aside.
I mean, it's interesting that China abstained in the UN vote on Crimea. I imagine that the Chinese government looks at the actions of the Russian leader and has some concerns about the implications of that sort of behavior. Because while the Chinese do have leaders, as far as I can understand, and I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, invested in the kind of worldview that Steve mentioned, the thing about the Chinese power is how much they're literally invested in the Western economic order, however much they, in some sense, may regret it, or certainly not regret it, but certainly resent it. And so they have, and we pointed this out in the paper, that there are significant contradictions and tensions within this autocratic alliance or entente or whatever you wish to call it. And one of them is the different ways that these Russia and China engage in the international economies, which are quite different. Russia, in some sense, an oil-based autocracy. And dependent on that. And China, a much more developed form of state-led capitalism, which has joined forces with the Western order and to advance its interests. So there's a certain degree of contradiction and tension within that position. I think that expresses itself to some extent on what may have been a risk-free abstention by China in the UN, but perhaps evokes its own concerns and the tensions within the alliance that is, or the entente, or whatever we can't find a good word for this because it's really not an alliance. We're constantly looking for the right word. And I have nothing to add on the Saudi. I mean, the Saudis are lashing out. I mean, they're profoundly unhappy with the U.S. position in Syria. They are very, very unhappy with the U.S. support of the negotiations with Iran and the prospect of an agreement, which they find absolutely terrifying, and the events in Egypt. And they are exercising the kind of influence they traditionally exercise. Where this will go is hard to know. It's a very difficult moment.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add one point on the Gulf piece here. I mean, I think right now we're still in a damage control relationship rebuilding phase. The president's visit to Saudi Arabia last week, I think, mostly focused on Iran and Syria. From early initial readouts, it seems that the role that they're playing in Egypt was really not on the agenda. So at this point, there's a lot of relationship rebuilding to be done, and that visit was clearly meant to do exactly that. But on the list of things that the U.S. is talking with our Saudi counterparts about, where does this fall within all of the asks that we're making? I don't think it's at the top. So I think there's a sort of tacit acceptance of the status quo in terms of the role that's being played. As the Saudis, as Dan said, they're irate with us in terms of the negotiations with Iran and the very tepid role that we've been playing in terms of equipping and training in Syria. So if anything, they have as much of an upper hand in this relationship right now as we do. I will note that the U.S. has been engaging with the United Arab Emirates in a very different way in terms of trying to channel economic assistance that the UAE is providing in ways that would be more economically sustainable and advantageous to the Egyptian economy, not necessarily advocating for reform per se, but at least incorporating that financial assistance in some sort of strategic plan that will ultimately be better in terms of job creation and growth. So there's some engagement on that piece.
Yes, please.
Hello, thank you. My name is Dana Daoud. I'm from the Embassy of Jordan. I can't speak for the other countries, but I do feel that each country has its own unique domestic fiber, and it's facing different challenges. Each country has different countries around them. So, in the case of Jordan, I know that our government has accelerated a local reform process and has faced a huge influx of refugees since 2011. We have 600,000 refugees, 1.2 total Syrians in Jordan. We have Iraqi refugees. We have limited resources, interruptions of the Egyptian gas pipeline, and yet, meanwhile, we have a roadmap, we have milestones, we have a slow process, but it's moving forward. So my question, I guess, is, are these elements factored in? And are we expecting too much too soon? Is 4 years enough for a democratic journey? I mean, this country is still, it's been 200 years and we're still evolving, and is 4 years enough to evaluate this? And are all these elements for each country factored in? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Steve, go ahead.
No, I mean, well, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I would just say one shift I think that has come out of all of this is a much more country-specific approach in really looking at the political and economic realities on the ground in terms of both the changes underway and U.S. policy towards them. I think that's been a positive outcome. But I would also say that I think part of what's really at question is, what are the nature of the changes underway? What is the nature of the roadmap or the transition process? Is this really a devolution of power away from the center? Is this really an opening up of other political actors to have real decision-making authority or not? And I think that's really where you get into the core of the issue is, is this window dressing? Are real changes happening below the surface? Are people being able to fundamentally exercise their basic rights? And those are the kind of criteria that I think people are using to assess where countries are along their path, and it certainly is unique to every country.
I agree, and I would only amplify that in the sense that you're absolutely right, that Jordan has in many ways, taken the lead in embracing the importance of reform. And yet, the question of whether the reform programs it has adopted, including in the period since the Arab uprisings began, really do get at the fundamental concerns that have been so powerful in driving disenchantment and grievances within the Jordanian public about the performance, the economic and the political performance of the Jordanian leadership, I think is an open question. And the question of time, of how much time is needed, in some respects is not one that anyone sitting on this side of the Atlantic can answer. It's one that really lies in the hands of Jordanian decision makers who have to calculate for themselves whether they are moving with sufficient speed and breadth and depth to implement reforms that not only move in the direction of things like national political parties that will, over time, one hopes, transform competitive politics in Jordan, but whether they're moving to introduce changes that will really produce the fundamental shifts in the performance of institutions and in some of the privileged relationships and lack of transparency and concerns about corruption and concerns about misuse of resources and lack of accountability and all of those other very, very fundamental issues that I think many, many Jordanians feel fall outside the scope of the current reforms. And that's not to suggest that they don't feel, in some respects, quite fortunate to be living in a society in which there is at least some degree of commitment to reform. I think they look around the region and see that things could be an awful lot worse. But I think that's different than suggesting that the efforts undertaken thus far are seen by Jordanians themselves as adequate in responding to some of these very fundamental issues that continue to need to be addressed. And when they look back over the last, well, it's been since the 1980s, in some respects, that a reform process has been underway, I think it can, they can be forgiven for asking, how long a process of gradual reform is needed before we really reach some of these fundamental issues.
I'd only add that when I'm in Morocco, the Moroccans insist that they're the ones that are ahead of the curve. So I will have to.
Yes, last question.
Hi, Lars Hansen. Very, very fascinating discussion, but throughout this I think of only one thing that kind of sticks in my mind. When we had our revolution, we had over 570 years of an evolving idea of democracy. We've since had almost another 230 years, which gives us about 8 centuries of experience. Democracy is unique in that it requires the participation and understanding of the people who are being governed in a democracy. And what I don't hear in talking about the Middle East right now is I don't see in the Middle East that foundation. So when you talk about trying to impose democracy from the top through reform, I don't see that can be done. That's a matter of having to get the people on board. And so so far, I haven't seen that, and I would be very interested in hearing what your comments are on how you get democracy and the necessary ideas and principles instilled in that region of the world.
Thank you for opening the door to one of the most longstanding, deepest, contentious, and unresolved questions surrounding the political future of the Arab world. We can handle that in 30 seconds. I don't see any reason why not. Look, I think what you've touched on is, as I said, one of these, sort of core issues in anyone, for anyone who's concerned about processes of democratic change. Is it necessary to have Democrats in order to produce democratic institutions? Or can the development of democratic institutions produce Democrats? And we have broadly differing views on this. Jean Kirkpatrick, in her famous article, Dictatorships and Double Standards, was very much of the Burkean view that until you had democratic political cultures that had firmly taken root organically within societies, demanding democracy, efforts to impose change from outside were utterly a waste of time. You have others, political scientists, Adam Jaworski, John Waterbury, who felt, Vali Nasser, who wrote a very interesting article about the transition from Islamic, about how to create Muslim Democrats. I mean, so do democratic institutions and processes discipline societies, citizens, leaders in ways that lead them to behave democratically, or must they be Democrats ahead of time in order? Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I tend to think that it is worthwhile moving along both tracks simultaneously. I would be concerned if we felt that we needed to wait until some society had met some arbitrarily imposed benchmark of what it means to have an adequately democratic political culture before we decided it was worthwhile investing in democratic institutions in that country. But it's a big question.
And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. And serve that side, please. Help yourself to someone.
Thank you. Good. Very good.
30 people on the
Thank you.
That's
but
great.
they didn't have any questions.
Huh,
because
interesting.
I always take their questions.
Right, no, I that was pretty good.